Hello and welcome to Say Hi to the Future, Ingenious Thinkers, a podcast aimed at highlighting the human side of ingenuity. My name is Ken Tencer, curator of Say Hi to the Future, helping leaders think differently in the face of uncertainty and ambiguity. Better thinking, better outcomes. With me today is Jasmine Burton, a design thinking, global health consulting, impact accelerating, and social enterprise founding hybrid professional. Jasmine Burton, welcome to Say Hi to the Future.
Hey, Ken. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
So, Jasmine, let's start with a little travel talk. You were recently in Zambia. Tell us why. Tell us what you were doing there.
Yeah, it's a great question. I spent about 3 weeks. I was in Zambia, in different parts of the country. I actually spent the year right out of college. I studied at Georgia Tech. When I graduated, I spent the year after in Zambia, working through an organization called Global Health Corps. And that was my first exposure into like the global social impact space. Particularly, it gave me the opportunity to follow my passions in the toilet economy, which is a very niche world, if you can imagine. But as a toilet designer that I discovered at Georgia Tech, gave me the opportunity to pursue that work internationally. And so since then, we've been able to do a lot of work in Zambia. But because of COVID, there was a lot of delays. There's a lot of, you weren't able to travel. And so this past trip, was the opportunity to go back to see work that we had started actually in 2015, 2016 that still was around through COVID, through some other big global health concerns that the country had experienced, which was actually really beautiful to see our work was still there. And I had the opportunity to see one of my good friends that I got to live with and work with in that year out of Georgia Tech get married. And so it was a traditional Zambian wedding, and getting to see all the traditions, being a part of all the cooking, the dancing, the singing for several ceremonies was also an incredible thing. So it was a little bit of work and a little bit of personal, which is a great trip in my book.
It sounds like a wonderful balance. So, you talked about the toilet economy. You went to Georgia Tech, one of the leading design education schools programs in the world. How do you get involved with the toilet economy?
It's also a great question. Yeah, so I coming to college, I knew that I was very interested in pursuing work in the creative space. I wasn't totally convinced that I was a STEM person, but Georgia Tech saw something in me, and I, increasingly over time realized that STEM and critical problem solving, creative thinking is really embedded in what it means to be in STEM, and so that was sort of an aha moment for me. But in the College of Design at Georgia Tech, I really had this opportunity to explore what does it look like to be a creative professional in a way where you're creating things. It's not just art, it's functional art. That's sort of how I position design. Creating a table that actually meets the needs of someone, and the ergonomics that someone who's using the table, acknowledging that different types of people have different needs. How do you co-create solutions with communities so that you're creating something that actually works within their context? And so these were sort of the nuggets of things that I learned at Georgia Tech. And really, there was a moment in a manufacturing class where I learned there's this concept called designing from cradle to grave. So when you're creating something, acknowledging that it's not always going to last forever. So how do you design it in a way that so that it can be disposed of in a way that might be circular or recycled or used in a way that's usable in the future, or not, depending on sort of your
Mhm.
priorities or your ability. And sort of that was a moment where I was like, I don't want to design trash. Like, I want to design something that's like meaningful and has like solving someone's problem. And so that was like my beginning of like, exploring what could it look like to design for impact, right? Like, what does it mean to create something for impact?
Right.
A few months later, I went to a conference and I learned about the global sanitation crisis and how like 2 billion people today don't have access to toilets, and how this particular reality disproportionately impacts women and girls around the world. And as someone who's in college, had the opportunity to pursue higher education in my career beyond, just thinking about a toilet being a reason that someone wouldn't be able to go to school or pursue their livelihood or pursue their passion just
Right.
seems like a crazy reality in the world that we live in. And so that was the moment. I was 18. I called my parents and I said, I'm going to design toilets. And the rest is history. I, dove into that world. I had the opportunity in my senior design capstone at Georgia Tech to actually implement a toilet with this concept of human-centered design and human-centered problem solving. But yeah, toilets were my gateway into the world of social impact, and I am grateful for it every day.
Well, we'll talk about that because I mean, again, when you talked about 2 billion people without access, I mean, that's 25% of the world's population. You talk about the gateway into social impact. So you were not designing for downtown department stores for people to put into their homes or whatever. You had a very specific purpose. So talk to us about that and how that sort of bridged you into the sustainability type journey.
Yes, yeah. I think it's something where, if it's a problem or reality that you're not familiar with, or you don't, have a reason to know, it's something that you might not ever think about, right? And this idea of, how much a toilet and having the ability to separate our lives from waste, in our day-to-day in terms of health and hygiene, how much that enables us to do. And sort of that was the first line of thinking for me. And in addition to that, right, like in terms of health access, there's so many people that contract all these diseases that are connected to lack of sanitation. But then there's like this whole other thinking, right? That if you think back to more indigenous ways of living and existing and infrastructure in the world, and sort of what's something that is sort of prioritized in a lot of businesses now in a world where we have sustainable development goals, we have these ESG standards that a lot of businesses are trying to track towards for environmental and social impact. You have this concept called the circular economy, right? So this idea of how do you turn waste into something useful, and particularly as it relates to sanitation, yes, there's this need to get, separate people from their waste to live healthy lives, but there's also an opportunity to turn waste into something else, into something that's productive, right? And in a reality where it's like, as the human population continues to grow, it's like the waste we produce is going to be the only resource that continues to grow with us. And so how do we continue to create and innovate in a way that enables us to reuse waste, and reuse it in a way that's human-centered, right? Like I work in toilets, so I can talk about gross things, but you don't want to be touching and you don't want to be dealing and changing your behaviors on the day-to-day so that you're more sustainable. So this idea, it poses a really interesting design challenge of how do you create something that's useful, that's aspirational, but also that is sustainable, it is closed looped, but also that it, makes it easy for you to want that or opt into that behavior. And so in our work, we focus really on the physical design of the toilet, but also that idea of what happens next. It's not just about getting the waste away. It's sort of what are the opportunities to partner with folks on the ground to sort of create sort of more of the circular economy within the toilet economy.
You're talking about waste as a resource. What does come next? Because I've never thought of waste as a resource. So what is the positive output that you're speaking to?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think there are a number of different forms that resources can take, and particularly when you're thinking about how we use toilets and how the outputs there. There's a number of different frames that you can take, and so one of them is turning waste into energy, right? This idea of how might we create toilets and sanitation systems and structures that actually, instead of taking your waste to a wastewater treatment plant that treats the water at a large scale, and may or may not be used in different systems or might be flushed out into larger bodies of water. Instead of that, maybe like what are ways for us to dry out the waste and make it into briquettes? That's what it's called, like fuel sources. And sort of the organization actually that I worked with right out of college, right before I moved to Zambia, called Sanovation. They're based in Kenya, and they really focus on this idea of turning briquettes, the community's waste, having infrastructure that dries out the waste, and then that becomes the fuel for a lot of the local businesses, governments, et cetera. You can do that at scale in a number of different ways, but that idea of like waste to energy. There's
Okay.
yeah, like there's other technology. So the Gates Foundation, there's a lot of really interesting toilet technologies there, the turning waste into, other things like clean water, which again, when you think about the human,
Right.
right? Like you can sort of say it's clean water all day, but when you're like, that came from a toilet, you might have some questions. And so I think that it's a really interesting opportunity to sort of think about, what what are the needs that you have? What are the what does the community want? What are the pieces of education that surrounds the system that you're designing?
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and how do you co-create those things to exist in tandem? And so, yes,
Yeah.
energy, water, those are some of the
Yeah.
many outputs that could exist within toilets.
Yeah. And it's somewhat coincidental. I mean, we had a young man from South Africa on last week, a scientist who was working on clean water and how to clean that water in remote communities and help to create through solar power clean, usable water in remote areas. So yeah, we didn't talk sanitation, but we did talk a lot about the balance between sanitary, clean water sources in remote areas of Africa. So this actually ties well into our recent discussions.
Yes,
Um,
yeah.
this is sort of an interesting question just for me. Hopefully the listeners care, but um, sorry. You worked on from a consulting perspective, I believe you worked with the United Nations on the third, fifth, and sixth Sustainable Development Goal targets. So I'm not asking you verbatim on third, fifth, and sixth goal targets, but tell us about the United Nations and their role and how that sort of came about for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think, yeah, so for many folks that work kind of in social impact sustainability, the United Nations, convened in I think around 2015 and sort of had these goals, these 17 sustainable development goals that organizations, countries, leaders came to the table and said, this is what we need to prioritize in order to make the world better for people and the planet, right? And these are the things we're going to prioritize. These are, ways we're going to measure them. And the lanes of work that I sort of sit in today, sort of the third being around health and well-being. So what does it mean to
Mhm.
create societies, infrastructures, businesses that enable people to live well? The fourth sustainable development goal is newer in my life, but it kind of all ties together. But it's really focused on education and equitable access to education and the future of work. And we're thinking about this time, especially coming out of the pandemic in a world of AI. There's so much uncertainty in work and school and learning. And so what does it mean to
Mhm.
create equitable systems and infrastructure for that? The fifth is around gender equality. And so there's been a really consistent through line in a lot of my work around particularly that.
Sure.
Yeah, it just across a lot of different work and yeah, the projects I've been a part of. And then the sixth is really around this water, sanitation, and hygiene sort of, how do we track and progress in as it relates to water, sanitation, and hygiene? Yeah, and those are sort of the priorities. I think the United Nations is the convening body that sort of set the tone, set the standards,
Mhm.
brought the conversation to light. All of these goals sort of have the time horizon until 2030. So we're, coming up on that soon. And sort of this idea of how do we talk about things that are working? How are we talking about things that aren't working? How are we bringing uh, diverse stakeholders to the table? That's sort of where the conversation is today to make sure, especially as it relates to the sixth sustainable development goal. We're behind. There's a lot of data that
Mhm.
shows that we need 4x investment in time, resources, people to actually get to the goals that we set in 2015 to reach the goals for 2030. And so that's again sort of the role of the United Nations is sort of helping convene, helping to set the standards, helping with the data collection, and helping to disseminate like where the gaps are. And so I've not worked directly with the United Nations, but by way of other consulting projects, like
Sure.
tracking towards those goals and sort of being in conversation and also, leveraging kind of human-centered design, which I learned at Tech, I learned through my toilet journey, this idea of just again, how do we talk about, how do we empathize with people? How do we co-create solutions together? And how do we iterate based off of those learnings?
Mhm.
When we put things in front of people rather than sort of standing the course. If we actually want to
Right.
build a future that is better for the people on the planet, we're going to have to learn how to iterate together. And sort of that's the nature of the work that I tend to be pulled into, is conversations around that.
And when you talk to the future of the planet and people on the planet and whatnot, and these goals, the UN goals, is this really one of the driving forces or impetus for Wish for Wash?
Yes, yeah, that's a great question. Yes, so Wish for Wash was a direct result of, coming out of Georgia Tech, working with Sanovation, working on specific toilet innovation, so very specific to product. But then you realize, right, like products don't exist in a vacuum. There's supply chains, there's people, there's education, there's all these components that need to exist in order for this toilet to even be considered by anyone, right? And so this
Mhm.
idea of, we started off, at Tech before I actually graduated, creating a nonprofit. And so it's an organization that is really focused on equitable access to and driving innovation as it relates to sanitation. But also this idea of, how do we create a culture of, or the next generation of people who are thinking about empathy, who are thinking about iteration, who are thinking about human-centered problem solving in the way that we've approached our toilet design. Because when you zoom out to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, all of these targets, again, we haven't reached them. We have limited time, and the ways that we've been working in the past are not getting us there. And so we do need to be more iterative. We need to prototype things. We need to trial things before we invest lots of time and resources. How do we learn, fail fast, fail quickly, fail cheaply? And again, these are sort of mindsets of human-centered
Yeah.
problem solving. And so yes, that is like the goal of Wish for Wash, which is now really focused on, education, building a kind of like a workforce or the next generation of thinkers, makers, that sort of hold these mindsets. And so wherever you end up going, you sort of are thinking about, okay, how might we empathize with the customers we're looking to serve, or the people that are meant to use the toilets? Maybe they're not paying for them, but how do we
Mhm.
include them in the story so that they're actually going to be used in the long term? And how do we actually integrate their feedback in the next generation of the product or service that we're creating? And I think that's been really cool to see the evolution of Wish for Wash over time, from being like, it's a toilet, and now it's like an ecosystem of thinking and ways of working.
And so this ecosystem, is it students? Is it grads? Like how does it all sort of work and manifest?
Yes, yeah. So it is a lot of students, particularly very deep roots at Georgia Tech. So we have a lot of Georgia Tech folks that come through Wish for Wash by way of, different classes. So sometimes this could be like through for class credit. This could be an internship opportunity. It could be an after school sort of extracurricular type opportunity. So the way that folks engage with us as a nonprofit is not really fixed. It sort of depends on what makes sense for your schedule and the projects that we have at hand. And we've created a space and an opportunity for a lot of young folks, particularly in college, grad students, and young professionals, to sort of understand the urgency around things like water, sanitation, and hygiene, the complexity of it, and just how critical it is for us to be interdisciplinary in our approach. Like, you might be the
Mhm.
best mechanical engineer in the world, but you're not going to be able to solve this problem on your own. You need to be able to work with policymakers and public health practitioners. And so how do we enable folks to learn these things, but then also lead projects, pieces of research, new prototypes? And so it's been a really cool opportunity to, again, expand beyond just like one concept that we believe in and that we're really proud that still exists in Zambia, but then also expanding that opportunity for other young people that are kind of early in their career and at school at large, to sort of hold some of these complex mindsets and learn how to work together on some of these challenging
Mhm.
problems. And so that's, yeah, we work a lot with schools, but then also some high schools actually in the greater Atlanta area have partnered with us for some of their capstone work. And so that's been really cool to see in the K-12 system. So mostly students and some young professionals as a way to sort of introduce them to this complex way of thinking, and also potentially kind of this human-centered design skill set that they can take beyond kind of sanitation.
So what is a skill set that you've been talking about, human-centered design skill set?
Yes, yes. So, I kind of alluded to it a little bit at the beginning, but this idea of the ability to empathize, acknowledging like who are the people that are touching the thing that we're making, and how do we make sure that we're including their pain points, their voice into the work? So empathy as a big component of it. And then sort of that idea of prototyping. So, okay, once you've researched, once you've talked to people, once you understand the root of the problem based off of the people that experience it and the people that touch it, what types of quick solutions can you put together based off of what you have? Sometimes it's
Mhm.
not, you don't have a lot of funding. Sometimes you don't have a lot of resources, but how can you get directional feedback, in a quick way to move forward with, this is a good solution or it's not. And so that prototyping is a big piece of the human-centered design skill set. So once you've prototyped, and then this idea of, okay, you put it in front of people, you get their feedback. So the iteration is the next part. So you iterate the solution that you've put in front of them based off of the stakeholders or the users' feedback. And then you sort of implement it again, and sort of this idea that it's nonlinear, it's circular, it's in community, it's in dialogue, it's in testing rather than sort of assuming that the solution and investing a lot of time, resources into that. It's sort of this more ground up approach. Which again, there's a lot of challenges with that, like in practice and with timelines and with financing and with other
Mhm.
stakeholders that have competing priorities. But again, as more and more people, our kind of theory of change is as more and more people have this mindset, like we'll sort of see more systems, products, services, programs sort of holding that way of thinking of how might we be able to flex our timeline so that we can make sure learners, the employers, farmers, whoever it is that is, experiencing the problem that you're designing or, programming around can actually be a part of the solutioning. So that way,
Right.
when we get to the end of it, we've co-created it and it has more of a chance of being successful in the long run. So yeah.
It sounds a lot like or sort of what I like about it is it sounds like people get things done more quickly and start to develop or appreciate or taste small successes or failures, but that immediate feedback, not waiting and waiting and waiting. As a 30 plus year entrepreneur, it's like when I put my head down and I'm rubbing my forehead going, can't we just do something? Just somebody just do something, stop talking and do something. It seems very much that yes, there's a lot of thinking, but you actually do something. And I love that.
Yes. And I think too, there's so much like, and I don't know your thoughts on this, but I think there's so much like fear or like hesitation around like the doing. Sometimes they're like, oh, I don't know enough. I don't have enough.
Yeah.
I'm not in the right place. And it's like none of those things are ever like likely or ever going to be true or stack up at the right time. So it's
Mhm.
like, how do we create that mindset of like, you can try something now based off of what you know, and it'll give you feedback or give you some directionality to tell you if you're headed in the right way. So yes, I love that way of like
Yeah.
moving from the thinking to the doing, and how do we enable people to do that faster?
And what I always sort of how I sort of bucket that is also, and make sure that whatever you're doing financially will not ruin your business if you're wrong. And
Yes.
it won't disappoint your clients because with the minimum viable products, I'm always like, some of them are too minimum,
Yes, that's true.
and that scares me too. And I always say, hey, don't let it hurt your company financially, maybe a little pinch, if you will, and don't disappoint customers in the market in a big way because then you're cooked.
Yes. Yep. And I think that's a really good point. And I think that's a really like important thing to consider when doing this type of work, because it's hard. It's really hard to especially if you're in a world where you're dealing with funders or like philanthropy or like donors, where there are these like status quo sort of ways of doing projects, and you're trying to
Mhm.
integrate and you're trying to change those things. And so it's like, how do you stay true to that? But then how do you also like how do you stay true to the needs of your funders, as well as how do you stay true to the needs of the community? And it's not a
Absolutely.
zero sum, right? Like it's trying to figure out what's the based off of where they are, and based off of where you are, like what's the best possible outcome, or how can we come together? And so I think sometimes people feel like there's an exact science to human-centered design, and it's like, no, no, it's not always going to be the same. It's not always going to look the same in each project or program. And it's about how can you bring the rest of your team, your funders along in that journey,
Yeah.
especially if they're used to a certain way of working. And so, yeah, it's a good point. You don't want to cannibalize your business or your funding, but you want to like figure out that sweet spot in between.
The sweet spot's pretty simple, if you will. I mean, human-centered design is the humans are the people who are writing the checks. So if you make them happy, you're making your funders happy. People overthink that too.
It's
No
true.
funder is going to come back and say, hey, I made it's a little different than what I originally imagined, but the customer said so and we sold 10x. I've never heard anybody go, "Oh, you suck for doing that."
Right, right. And I
As
think that
long
that's
as you're profitable.
yes, yeah. And I think that that's an important distinction too, is like that idea of, yeah, your funders, the people who write the checks are people
Yeah,
too. So
yeah,
practicing, leveraging those human-centered design mindsets and skill sets towards
yeah,
them is important.
yeah.
Yeah.
So Jasmine Burton, we've had an amazing conversation, but just before ending it, I mean, hybrid hype. What is hybrid hype?
Yes. Yeah. Well, great question. I think, I live in what I call, I have like a portfolio career. So I do a number of different things. So Wish for Wash is a big piece of what brought me into the impact economy. It's a big piece of my life to date. It's still a big piece of how I spend my time. But then there's also a number of other things, and hybrid hype is one of them. And it is independent consulting firm that allows me to help organizations with kind of leveraging human-centered design, particularly in
Mhm.
impact space. And so I found myself in health organizations and education organizations and the school systems, working with funders to support school systems. So at different levels and within different organizations, really, again, with this mindset of how do we, if we actually are staying true, if we are saying that we want to accomplish these impact goals, how do we actually invite more participation, because the ways of working that we've held in the past they're not taking us in the direction that we want. And so we need to try something new. How do we invite, or how do we encourage that concept of prototyping within organizations? What does it mean? What does the prototyping even mean?
Right.
Like even starting there. And so I think that that's the nature of what hybrid hype is. It allows me to work with other organizations as a consultant. I do some facilitation, I do teaching, a number of different ways of bringing this thinking to people to sort of interrogate in their context. Like, what does it mean for us? And again, it's not zero sum. It's not like you have to follow all these check boxes and then therefore you're practicing human-centered
Mhm.
design. Here are all the tools, here are the mindsets, here are the skills that you would want to practice. What makes sense for you in your context? What makes sense for your funders, and what makes sense for you now versus tomorrow might look different. And I think that's been a really cool way of sort of using Wish for Wash as a case study to then expand to others, and pulling off of that and
Yeah.
empowering and inspiring others as we build more inclusive futures.
I love that. I love the fact that everything you're doing um, is so focused at the end on social activation, but that you are not just saying to people, well, just do it, and that it gets my back up when people are going, oh no, companies just have to do it. Well, that's great, but obviously they don't know what it is that they need to do, and they certainly don't know how. And you are speaking about process. You're speaking about approach. You are speaking about tying company goals to end social sustainability goals and targets. And I think that's critical. I think that's really critical. And I think that's really what I loved about speaking with you today and getting to know you more as through the Say Hi to the Future community, because um, yeah, you're sort of the antithesis of you should know better. And I think we have too much of that in the world.
Yes. Yeah. No, I really appreciate that. And yes, I'm excited that the future oriented lens too that you all hold, I think is really important. And I think the idea of how do we create conversations and spaces where people can come together, can talk about things, build things together, and then also have
Mhm.
hope for the future, have optimism for the future. And in a world where there's so much unknowns, and there's a lot of things like that are in technology and ways of working and systems, and a
Mhm.
lot of things are scary. And so I love this idea of sort of how do we say hi to the future? How do we welcome in the future in a way that's like hopeful, and generative and aspirational? So thank you for having me. This has been fantastic.
Thank you, Jasmine Burton, and we will speak again soon.
All right, thank you so much.